King Eurystheus had lived his life in the shadow of his cousin Heracles. Heracles was bold and brave and fierce and powerful. He went off fighting monsters and battling kings and warriors. He was all of the things that Eurystheus could have been, was destined to have been, but lacked that fundamental courage, that basic drive, that oomph to have seized and developed and become. And so he had sat in the shadows cast by his golden glorious cousin and fulminated and fumed. Being a king, well, that has its own glories, its own status and reward, but never the glories of being a great hero famed the length and breadth of Greece. Never the rewards of being the favoured one of Zeus. I mean, Eurystheus was the favoured one of Hera, but perhaps the goddess would have never said it out loud, but Eurystheus often felt that he was maybe a bit of a disappointment to her and not showered with the kind of rewards that Zeus heaped upon his son Heracles. And fate, literally fate, had placed within the grip of Eurystheus the chance to avenge himself upon Heracles, to make Heracles carry out one awful, terrible, impossible task after another, after another, after another, each one surely doomed to failure and shame and indignity and hopefully death. But there was Heracles, having defeated gigantic lions, enormous wild boars, multi-headed monstrosities that had slithered up out of a swamp in Lernia. He had battled monster upon monster upon monster, accomplished feats and achievements and tasks, everything that his cousin had dreamt up and thrown at him, Heracles had dealt with 11 times. And now there was one last opportunity to be done with this hated cousin. And Eurystheus sat and he thought and he schemed and he dreamed and he plotted, and at length, when cousin Heracles stood before him in the royal court to hear the last of his 12 labours, Eurystheus said, "You, cousin, must go into the very bowels of the earth, into the depths of Hades where the dead dwell, haunting and rattling their chains and plaguing the living with their wails and their torments. And in the very pits of Hades you will find the dog Cerberus, the great massive 3-headed slavering howling dog of the land of the dead, of the very pet of the god of the dead himself. And you must bring that dog alive out of Hades, bring him to my court, place him before my very throne, that I might look upon the 6 eyes of the dog of death and hear it howl. Then, and only then, cousin, will your labours be at an end, will your atonement for the death of your wife and children be complete." Well, a hush went round the court, and each and every dignitary of that court looked at each other and grimaced and thought to themselves, well, this is going to be it. This is going to be the end. And even Heracles, 6'6" and built like a brick shithouse, even he cannot possibly bring back Cerberus from the pits of Hades and plonk him alive in the court of Eurystheus. Cannot be done. Well, Heracles took his orders, bowed before the throne, if not necessarily before the person who sat in the throne, and went off. It was a long walk to the entrance to the land of the dead. Indeed, many people were unsure if there was an entrance to the land of the dead, and those who were sure that there was an entrance to the land of the dead could never agree with each other quite where it was. And it might be asked if maybe part of the problem was that maybe there wasn't simply one entrance to the land of the dead. Maybe there were multiple ones, or it moved. A floating entrance, who can say? But Heracles sat and he prayed to Olympus, he prayed to the gods, and Zeus, his father, heard, and directed Hermes, god of travellers, guide of the dead, known to the ancient Greeks by his other title, Psychopompus, the one who leads the dead on their final journey. He came down to earth, the fleet-footed god, and beckoned Heracles to follow him, and silently, like himself, as if he were a ghost, he led Heracles through the lands of Greece, mile upon mile upon mile upon mile, in a journey that took many days and many nights, until at length they came to a place. And I am forsworn from telling you what that place is, lest you might go there and chance your arm at entering into the land of the dead, and rather more than your arm, frankly, because the land of the dead is well guarded. There sat Cerberus, massive, 20 feet from paw to shoulder, with 3 great slavering heads, massive fangs in each mouth, eyes burning, all 6 of them, like red-hot coals, a tail at the end of his torso, flailing, and on the occasion when it slowed down a little, Heracles could see it was not an ordinary dog's tail, but a serpent growing out of the dog's backside, a great fanged and poisonous serpent. And about the neck of the central head there was a great chain of adamantine studded with diamonds. Well, Heracles was not too sure what he was meant to do, and he approached the guardian dog somewhat nervously, as you would. And the dog wagged its tail, lolled its 3 tongues, drooped its 6 ears, and looked at him with that puppyish expression that melts the heart of even the fiercest warrior. And Heracles began to think to himself, what is this? These stories, these rumours, these tales told of Cerberus as this fierce and monstrous beast. Look at him, he's a huge overgrown puppy. And indeed, as he approached Cerberus, the dog rolled onto his back, paws in the air, and Heracles, perhaps against his better judgment, got close enough to rub Cerberus's belly, and the 3 heads made those weird, woofly noises that dogs will make when you rub their belly. And the glowing presence of Hermes held out a hand, and in that hand Heracles saw 3 discs, and the god held his hand towards Heracles, who responded to the silent gesture by taking the 3 discs with the hand that wasn't rubbing the belly of the beast. And Heracles saw that these 3 discs were in fact oatcakes, the kind of oatcakes that are often left upon altars and gravesides as gifts to feed the dead. And smelling them, he got a very strong aroma of honey, and indeed his hand was quite sticky from holding the 3 oatcakes. But there was something else, some other aroma that he couldn't quite place that reminded him of poppy fields and all of those red petals nodding in the breeze. But there were 3 cakes, and the dog had 3 heads, so Herakles joined the dots and cast an oat cake into each open mouth, and the 3 of them snapped shut and swallowed the oat cakes. The tail wagged and thumped upon the earth and nearly caused a mini earthquake until each of the 6 eyes began to droop and the heads began to loll, and soon the mighty dog rolled over and all 3 heads snored thunderously. Well, the dog was subdued, and Herakles thought to himself, how am I going to pick a beast this size up? But he had managed to wrestle the Nemean lion off the ground, which was almost as big as Cerberus, but Hermes held out a hand and signalled that it was not yet time to pick up the dog. Hermes pointed towards the gate that the dog guarded, and the gate opened. Herakles descended into the lands of the dead, and it would be a long, long story to tell you of every single thing that he saw and encountered on that great long journey into the lands of the dead. But one small incident I will recount. After walking for what seemed like miles upon miles upon miles, getting deeper and deeper and deeper on paths, tunnels that sloped down into the earth, passing by torches burning in sconces upon the walls, for there is no sunlight, no starlight, no moonlight in the lands of the dead, only the burning torches left there by the passage of certain beings whose names are best not mentioned. Every now and then he would pass a cavern and see things in the cavern, see the fates of different people who were dead, some recently dead, some long, long dead. But at one point the tunnel widened into a great cavern, and there were many brands burning, giving, well, not quite as much light as the sun would give, but enough to see by. And within this cavern were cattle, mooing and lowing and chewing upon grass, or whatever it was that grows in the caverns of the dead. And there a herdsman, a great, lumpy, strange-looking herdsman, whom Herakles recognised. It was the same herdsman he had encountered on the island of the Cyclops Geryon, when he had been battling that monster to acquire the cattle herd belonging to Geryon. He had met this other herdsman who had his own herd, which he'd been taking up to eat on the island of Geryon. And here they were eating in the lands of the dead, and this struck Herakles as suspicious. Something was going on, and immediately he rushed towards the herdsman, and the herdsman grabbed hold with 2 hands his great wooden staff and began to swing it at Herakles, and the 2 joined in battle. And Herakles, being the stronger, even though the herdsman was a big lad, nonetheless Herakles picked him up, and he began, for Herakles had entered the land of the dead unarmed, no swords, no clubs, none of his usual weapons which he had left behind, for you cannot go armed into the lands of the dead. He crushed and he crushed and he crushed the body of the herdsman until he heard bones beginning to snap, and the herdsman threw back his head and roared with pain. And a voice, not the herdsman's voice, but a feminine voice, a gentle voice, a voice like cut crystal, sliced across the mooing of the cattle, the roaring of the herdsman, the huffing and puffing of Herakles himself as he squeezed and squeezed, and said, "Warrior, son of Zeus, put down my herdsman and I will aid you if you leave him alive, if not unharmed, for I've already heard the snapping of bones and know he is harmed already. And ceasing to squeeze just for a second, Heracles looked across, and there was the figure that, although he had never met her, he had seen statues of her and knew it could only possibly be Persephone, Queen of the Dead. And when you encounter the Queen of the land you are in and she makes a request of you, it is churlish to deny that request. So he let drop the herdsman, who fell to the ground groaning and gasping at his broken ribs. And Persephone approached and placed a hand upon the herdsman, and it began to glow, and the light spread through his body, and those bones that were broken began to heal and mend. And at length the herdsman was able to stand up and lumber off, muttering imprecations under his breath and looking daggers at Heracles. But Persephone had made a promise that she would help Heracles if he let her herdsman go, and so she helped him. She led him to the palace of her husband Hades, king of the land which is named after him. And there they entered into this great dark palace that looked as if it was carved from onyx and obsidian, dark and mysterious. A gloomy place indeed. And they came through many corridors until eventually they passed into the great chamber where the king and the queen have their thrones and have audiences. And there sat Hades himself upon his grand throne, the chair next to him empty because Persephone was not sitting in it at that instant. And at his side, the king's side, was the dog Cerberus, who had been snoring paws in the air moments before. And he had not once passed Heracles on his journey through the lands of the dead. How he had got to the throne room without walking straight past Heracles, and you could hardly miss a 20-foot tall 3-headed dog walking past you, well, it was a mystery to the mighty warrior. But there the dog sat, not snoring, but awake, taking turns to rest each one of its 3 heads in Hades' lap as the king stroked the ears and the neck and the muzzle of his beloved dog, of his devoted pet, and all 6 eyes were looking at Heracles, and the tail thumping upon the floor of the chamber. Persephone introduced Heracles, and of course there was the presence of Hermes, silent but introducing God to God with the usual obeisances and respects. And Heracles, with a little help from Persephone, explained why he was there, for he, in all of the adventures he'd ever had never been quite as frightened as he was now, stood before the Lord of Death himself. And Hades is quite the spectacle, not one to be shared with minds that might be damaged by such horrifying descriptions. He had come to take the dog, and Hades would have none of it. His dog depart the land of the dead to fulfill some ridiculous quest dreamt up by some half-witted king? Absolutely not. He stamped his foot, he banged his hand upon the arms of the throne. He refused to allow it, and had it not been for the cajoling, for the persuasion, for the appeals made by Persephone, probably he would have stuck to his guns and refused to allow the dog to be carried away. And would Heracles have dared risking the wrath of the god of the dead by taking his dog without permission? That is something we will never need to know. But eventually, through the intercession of Persephone, Hades was convinced to allow for no more than 3 nights. Surely as much time as it would take, he argued, Herakles to escort the dog to the palace of Eurystheus and back again, which was rather shorter than the journey had taken coming in that direction, but never mind. That is what Hades conceded to. But the dog must be brought back, alive, unharmed, and returned to its post guarding the gates of the dead. Well, Herakles was pleased at this offer and offered to do great things on behalf of Hades in recompense. Deals were struck, the details of which we don't need to go into here. And turning round to leave, he was struck, Herakles, by the sight of another chair. Not as grand as the 2 thrones of the king and the queen, but ornate and elaborate, a very large chair, in which were sat 2 people, occupying the one seat. For Hades and Persephone, of course, are Olympian-sized. They are big beings with grand thrones, and the 2 beings sitting in the chair were human-sized. One of them Herakles recognised, for he had seen depictions of him in many places. It was Theseus, the famed and renowned warrior. The other he was less familiar with, but Persephone, seeing the look of puzzlement on the face of Herakles, said, "This is Pirithous, friend and companion to Theseus." Surely Theseus belongs in the land of the living, and maybe his friend does too. I've never heard of him before, but maybe he belongs in the land of the living too. Why are they here? Well, said Persephone, they came down into the lands of the dead with dubious intent. It was the wish of Pirithous to appeal to my heart, said the queen. And Hades scoffed and sneered. Appeal to your heart? He was planning to throw you over his shoulder and carry you off, whether he appealed or not. And Persephone conceded the point. And so, she said, my husband bade them sit in the throne to discuss what was going to happen. But this is the throne of forgetfulness. And when the dead sit in the throne of forgetfulness, all their memories depart. They can no longer recall why they're there, what they used to be, or anything. And it works not just on the dead, but on the living too. And so Theseus and Pirithous, they cannot remember why they came to Hades. They cannot remember who they are, what they've done, or anything. And to Herakles this seemed a terrible, terrible fate. For whilst it was certainly a very dishonourable thing to want to come and carry off Persephone thrown over a shoulder like a sack of flour, to have a mighty hero like Theseus stripped of his memories, of his purpose, of his calling in life, seemed a terrible loss to Theseus, to Herakles. And after a little more bargaining, the king of the land of the dead conceded that Theseus could return with Herakles to the land of the living, but Pirithous would have to stay put. Although there are some people who think maybe even Pirithous was allowed to return, but others insist no. Pirithous remained in the chair. Herakles held out his hand. The half shade of Theseus grabbed it, and he pulled his fellow hero from the seat, and at once, as soon as his bum departed the throne, all of the memories of his life and his purpose and his intent started, slowly at first, but getting faster and faster, started to return to the mind of Theseus as his self came back to him. And they journeyed forth, back the way they had come, not taking the dog with them, For Hades and Persephone had said, the dog will be waiting for you when you get back to the gate. And all of the journey back through the lands of the dead, and there were many more strange things that they saw and encountered on that journey, which are stories for another occasion. Never once did the dog pass them, and Herakles was particularly keen to keep an eye open to see how the dog got from one place to the other. But when they came at the end of their journey back to the gates, this time on the other side of the gates opened, and there, precisely as Persephone and Hades had said it would be, was Cerberus waiting. But whereas when Herakles had arrived to go into the lands of the dead, Cerberus had been woofing and tail wagging and tongue lolling and friendly. Now, as he tried to leave the land of the dead, particularly accompanied by someone who was halfway a shade, Theseus, for he had spent so long in the lands of the dead that he had practically become one of the dead himself. The three mighty heads of Cerberus peeled back their lips in terrible snarls. They began to howl. Saliva and slobber dribbled between their fangs and fell upon the earth. And Herakles, in a fleeting moment, as his heart was racing with fear and panic, noticed that where the saliva fell, aconite, wolfsbane, began to grow and spring up at alarming rates all around the cave area that Cerberus used as a kennel. Well, the heads were howling, and it was such a terrible noise, such a fierce noise, that the shades of the dead deep within the bowels of the earth began to wail and exchange, fear and terror ripping into their very bones. For that noise, that baying of the dog of the dead is truly a horrifying sight to behold, and would turn the blood of even the fiercest creature to water and ice. As I've said, Herakles had no weapon, no sword, no club, no bow and arrow, no nothing, for he had entered the land of the dead without such accoutrements as is required. And knowing that he had to take the dog alive, and that Hades would be enraged if some injury were done to the dog, he thought as to what he should do, and an idea came to him. He pulled his lion skin cloak close around him, as close as it would get, and pulled the lion's head down close up over his own head, so he could see through the eyes sockets of the lion's head itself, like a kind of a helmet. Now the skin of the Nemean lion is gold, almost not real gold, not actual metal, but gold in colour, and is as strong and tough as gold, as impenetrable as gold. Trying to claw your way through the coat of the Nemean lion, you may as well try and claw your way through a wall of solid gold, for all the good it will do you. And so when the dog went for him, head after head, snapping and snarling and trying to rip out his throat and bite off his arms and bite off his legs, painful as it was, because it was like being pinched by a great vice, but even the fangs of Cerberus could not penetrate the hide of the Nemean lion. Eventually, with much struggling and battling, he overcame the hound in much the same way he overcame the lion itself when the lion was alive, by putting its head, well, in this case, the central head, the one and only head. The Nemean lion had one only head, but the central head of Cerberus into an arm lock, squeezing and squeezing and squeezing and squeezing until, well, if a mighty dog could be said to go purple in the face, then that is what Cerberus began to do. Gasping and spluttering, eyes rolling back in its head, eventually it slumped to the floor, not dead, not injured, but gasping for breath, overwhelmed by the might of Herakles. And all this while that they were battling and battling, Theseus was running about the place, picking up boulders and lobbing them at the heads of the snapping dog. Every time it lunged at Herakles, Theseus would bounce a boulder off the head. So between the two of them, they had managed to subdue the mighty beast. And taking the great chains that had been left by Hermes as one last gift from the gods, they wrapped the chains, one around the great neck, central neck of Cerberus, and others around his paws to stop him running off. Heaved the dog up over one shoulder, even though the weight was so much it nearly broke Heracles' back. He bid farewell to Theseus, who made his journey off to Athens, his home, and thinking he had 1.5 days to get there, and it had taken him so many more days just to make the journey from the court of Eurystheus to the lands of the dead. How fast could I run unencumbered? And now I've got to carry this gargantuan dog. How fast can I go now? But Hermes lifted a finger and indicated that Heracles should not worry. The god of travel and speed held out his hand. Heracles placed his one free hand that wasn't holding the dog in position into the hand of the god Hermes, and like lightning they flew across the land, fast as only thought can go, for Hermes, as well as many other things, is the god of thought. And they arrived within what seemed like just a few minutes at the court of King Eurystheus. The doors of the palace burst open. In entered Heracles, unaccompanied now by Hermes, who had returned momentarily to Olympus, because mere mortals like King Eurystheus and the courtiers could not look upon one of the gods of Olympus without bursting into flames and ashes. Only a half-god like Heracles can look upon the faces of the gods and survive. Into the court he went. He heaved the dog off his shoulder, placed it upon the floor. He took the chains off its paws, he took the chain from around its neck, and the mighty beast stood up and shook itself, dribble and slobber flying hither and yon, landing like acid upon the floor of the court, sizzling, burning the tiles of the court and the walls and the clothing of the people it splattered. Everyone backed off in terror at the sight of this 20-foot tall 3-headed dog with a serpent for a tail that was hissing and spitting. The 3 heads threw themselves back and howled, and the smell of urine and the other things throughout the hall became unbearable as everyone gibbered and screamed and made a right mess. And the king himself, Eurystheus, had, just as he had done when the Erymanthian boar was placed before him at the end of that particular labour, he screamed with abject terror, leapt from his throne, dived into one of the enormous pithos jars in which they store wine and grain and such like things, and begged for the servants to put the plug in as he hid inside this massive jar that was buried halfway into the earth of the royal court. And the servants, even though they too were shaking with terror at the sight of Cerberus, put the plug back in, and some of them muttered they should leave it there, frankly. For Eurystheus was not popular with his own people. The dog had done everything that was required of it. It had made its grand appearance. The 3 heads turned to look at Heracles, and whilst, well, dogs can speak the language of dogs, but they can't speak Greek, it gave Heracles the look that said, "Now what?" And Heracles seized some of the great feast bones that was still on the table from some banquet or another that the king had been having, and chucked one to each head, which snapped at the bones and chomped them up like they were nothing but matchsticks. And the dog duly feasted. When Heracles tapped his shoulder, leapt up as if it were nothing more than a spaniel, even though it was 20 foot tall and weighed half a ton, and landed on Heracles' shoulder, and he staggered his way out of the court and held a hand upwards to Olympus itself. And the hand of Hermes came down from Olympus, grasped Heracles, and the distance between the court of King Eurystheus and the lands of the dead was covered in no more minutes than the journey in the other direction had happened. Done and dusted in less than the 3 days required of them. At the gates of the land of the dead, Cerberus was placed back upon his 4 paws, threw back his head and howled with joy and with happiness, and his ears flopped and his tongues lolled and his tail wagged, and he rolled over onto his back so that Heracles could rub his belly one more time, for he was happy to be home and to soon be seeing his master and mistress again. And there, a final tap upon the shoulder, was the hand of Hermes holding 3 more of those oat cakes soaked in honey and oil of poppy, the poppy juice, which, one to each head, put the dog back into a restful sleep. And there, essentially, the 12th labour was completed, as far as Heracles was concerned, although it has to be noted that even though they'd only been gone for quite a short period of time on the journey to and from the court of King Eurystheus, during that time the gates of Hades were unguarded, and it is the job of Cerberus to stop not so much the living going in as the dead escaping. So who or what escaped from Hades during the absence of the mighty dog? Well, therein is a heated debate for another time, and might explain why the world is quite as haunted as sometimes it is. But Cerberus remains loyal to his master and guards the gates of the lands of the dead from that day to this, and Heracles went on to rebuild the life that had been shattered by the deaths of his wife and children, and lived a good few more years and had a good few more adventures before his time came, and his body went into the lands of the dead and his spirit went up to Olympus to join the other gods. And there ends this story. Thank you.